If there's one thing that some analysts of economics and international relations often overlook, it's how geography and culture determine the behavior of nations. Or when they analyze the international scenario, they start from the assumption that other nations will see the world in the same way, and because of that, will have the same logical framework. Basically, they think that other nations think like they do. So what is a priority for my country would also be a priority for other countries. And that's exactly what we're seeing with the war in Ukraine. The West, the United States, and Europe can't understand how the Russians, the Chinese, the Indians, the Turks, and the Iranians think if we assume that they just want power. Of course, but the issue isn't power itself, it's the way they understand what power is. And the way they will achieve this power is what will differ. So we see situations where, for some reason, analysts think that China wants the war in Ukraine to end soon because it's affecting the European market, which is a big buyer from China. What they don't understand is that this is a somewhat outdated view of the world. A world, let's say, from the 90s, market-oriented, because basically we were under the relative hegemony of the United States. But even back then and today, that's not correct. For China, the issue in Ukraine is a matter of struggle for survival and power. And contrary to what people think, money is not power. They are different things. If China were as concerned about the market and economic issues as Western analysts think, it wouldn't have imposed such radical lockdowns on itself that put its own economy at risk. So no, it is not worried or pressuring Russia for this war to end soon. Because for it, this is an indirect conflict with NATO, and after Russia, it will be the next target. When I lived in Hong Kong, there was a common phrase that the city's population used to say, and they used it to refer to the Chinese, which basically was, only Chinese understand the mind of Chinese people, and that's true, but it applies to more peoples beyond the Chinese. In fact, this applies to all peoples who have had a different civilizational development. So when I see analysts, whether on YouTube channels or on television, talking about what other countries outside the Western Bloc want or think, I'm skeptical. Very skeptical and careful, because most people think with the mindset of the United States and Europe. And it's not that this is a problem, but the point is that the likelihood of them being wrong about what other nations outside this bloc want is very high. In the intelligence field, we call this culting, cultural intelligence, which is how much a person knows about the local culture. Because by knowing the culture, the history of those people, you will be able to more easily understand their logic, their perception of the world. This goes from small and seemingly insignificant details, which apparently don't matter, all the way to the grand strategy of nations. David Priestland, in his book A History of Power, makes a division of castes in human society. Even though there are some flaws in his perspective, his work helps to a moderate extent to understand the inclinations of different nations in international relations. Basically, Priestland talks about the transition from the first human societies to the emergence of states and the formation of castes, which he divides into three: the warrior caste, the sage caste, and the merchant caste. In a very summarized way, Priestland says that human societies evolved over time and were marked by these three castes. And throughout history, different civilizations are sometimes governed by one caste, sometimes by another. The dominant caste would ally with another caste to subjugate the third caste. And so this historical process would rotate over time and space. The warrior caste was the dominant caste in most of the world until the Middle Ages, and this caste was responsible for protecting society and the land. They were trained in the art of war and had access to weapons and horses for defense and attack. Then came the merchant caste, which began its process of dominance starting in the medieval period. This caste is responsible for trade and the production of goods and services. They were able to accumulate wealth and gradually converted it into political power. And finally, we have the caste of priests or sages. While it may seem that I am referring only to people responsible for spirituality and religious teaching, this caste would also include scientists, academics, bureaucrats, or essentially those who deal with psychological, mental, and intellectual aspects. And the different types of professions that we have would be connected, being part of one of these three castes, which over thousands of years have evolved and changed, but basically continue to be these three castes. His theory, as I said, has flaws, but the variables he brings help us at least understand the orientation of certain nations based on the profile of the dominant elites of those societies. So, as Priestland says, the leading caste associates with another caste to dominate the third caste, the resources, and the means of production. So, for example, countries with a predominance of the elite coming from the merchant caste are more oriented toward commerce and the pursuit of profit. So when we look at the United States historically, for example, we see that traditionally the dominant caste was the merchants. It's no coincidence that the United States was derived from the British Empire, which was also a society dominated by an elite linked to the merchant caste. This is interesting because in both cases, the British Empire and the United States, the merchant caste joined forces with the warrior caste, in this case, the military. Another example of this can be seen in China. Throughout almost all of its history, the merchants were the caste that provided the means for another caste to dominate that nation. Basically, the history of China is a power alternation, with sometimes the warrior caste dominating, sometimes the wise caste, but the dominant caste is always supported by the merchant caste. The only exceptions in the history of China generally occur in brief periods, usually during times of civil wars that last just a few decades or during some kind of major insurgency or political turmoil. Since we're talking about China, a few decades are brief periods for a nation that is thousands of years old. The last exception happened right after the Chinese Revolution in 1949, when the caste of wise bureaucrats from the Communist Party joined with the military caste to try to eradicate the merchant caste. And as a result, China suffered a series of calamities for 3 decades that cost the lives of at least 50 million Chinese people. The failures of the decisions made by the top leadership of the Communist Party, such as the Great Leap Forward or the Cultural Revolution, soon led Mao Zedong to turn to the merchant caste, which he had previously tried to exterminate, so that now they could help him save China and restore what China has always been, a predominantly commercial nation. Deng Xiaoping replaced the warrior caste with the merchant caste to support the power of the wise caste, that is, the top bureaucrats of the Communist Party. Understand in this sense that in the Chinese case, the wise caste would be these intellectuals of the Chinese Communist Party, who in a historical sense have a role similar to the former mandarins of the Chinese Empire, highly intellectualized bureaucrats who managed the Chinese Empire at the time and who today do the same thing, but through the Communist Party. So China and the United States are extremely similar and different at the same time. More similar than they would like to admit, but more different than they would need to be. Both nations are oriented toward commerce. They are trading nations, but in the United States, the leading caste has been that of the merchant, the protagonist, while in China, the caste of the merchant or trader, depending on the translation you use in the book, is always the caste that supports another caste that is in power. This basically illustrates how both nations value commerce, but at the same time see commerce in different ways. Americans see commerce as their way of life, while the Chinese see commerce as a tool of power. Which brings us to Russia, where the merchant class has never been influential. If we take a moment to analyze the history of Russia, whether in the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union, or the Russian Federation, we basically see an alternation between the military caste and the caste of the wise rising to power. Sometimes the military in the empire, sometimes a more religious Russia, then the military again, then the bureaucrats of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, and nowadays the so-called Siloviks, who are the elite connected to Russia's security apparatus. But this alternation of power in Russia, with sometimes the warrior caste and sometimes the wise caste rising to power, happens with one supporting the other simultaneously, and the merchant caste is usually left out of this dispute. So the wise caste rises to power with the support of the warrior caste, and then the warrior caste takes back power with the support of the wise caste. Maybe here you are confused because you're wondering what the logic is behind one caste supporting another caste to rise to power. But that's because you need to keep in mind that these are not three groups, but three castes. Each caste has several groups within it, and often these groups within the same caste fight or compete with each other or form alliances with groups from other castes. So, for example, when we talk about the warrior caste, of course, we're talking about the military, the armed forces, and police officers. But also think, for example, about athletes. Because in general, the groups that are part of the warrior caste value fame, glory, and displays of courage or physical achievement. In the merchant caste, don't think it's just a single group of merchants, but all those connected to the function of wealth production. That is farmers, industrialists, bankers, entrepreneurs, or groups that prioritize competitiveness and entrepreneurship. And in the caste of the wise, as I said before, don't just think of religious leaders, but also think of scientists and academics or even bureaucrats who run the state, groups that value the power of words and expression, the power of knowledge, and the importance of hierarchy, and so on. And remember that even within a caste, groups can also prioritize different things. For example, religious sages will value faith, but sages, technocrats, or what we would call scientists, will value skepticism. For example, don't see all of this in a very rigid way, because there are exceptions and particularities in each group. Understand that his theory is just a metric, a compass that helps us simplify some historical or geopolitical context, and not a sacred scripture that must be followed to the letter. So, using this as a guideline, notice that in most cases, democratic countries are those where the dominant caste is the merchant caste. There are exceptions, but in general, in democratic countries, the merchant caste, if it is not the one that dominates, is the one that supports the caste that is in power. Just like in countries where the dominant caste is the warrior or the sage caste, they will generally be dictatorships or more closed countries. This leads us to the question of why such elites eventually have this configuration, leaning more toward one caste or another. And the answer to much of this, although not all, comes from the geography of these countries. Today, I'm amazed at how the geographic factor was so summarily ignored by economics, international relations, and social sciences courses in the 90s and 2000s. In fact, even today, there are still professionals in these fields who ignore the influence of geography or think it has little value, believing it wouldn't have much influence. To believe that everything is a social construct and that aspects like geography and even genetics wouldn't influence people's decision-making and consequently leadership is literally the equivalent of flat earthism in the humanities. Jared Diamond, in the book Guns, Germs, and Steel, says that history took different paths for different peoples because of the differences between the environments they lived in, and not because of any supposed biological difference between peoples. Nowadays, since this book is already old, we know that there are some flaws in his statement by ignoring the biological factor. But the influence of geography on the evolution of different peoples shows how the Priestland theory, the caste theory, which divides them into elites, has a basis. Gerard explores how the geographical environment and biogeography influence social development, even though in the past many historians excluded this possibility because of what they call environmental determinism. And believe me, nothing bothers historians or other humanities scientists more than the possibility that human beings do not have control over their own destiny, often resorting to pseudoscientific theses or ignoring research from other fields. And that's why I find it so valid when scientists from the exact and biological sciences end up trying to venture into history, because not only do they bring a more technical and less passionate perspective, but they also end up being more scientifically rigorous than many historians who believe everything is just social construction. Because, as Diamond shows, thanks to the new information provided by science, through disciplines like genetics, molecular biology, behavioral ecology, linguistics, archaeological studies, and so on, it's possible to better understand how the environment influenced human development. He shows the importance of understanding how the environment affected different societies throughout history, from hunter-gatherer societies to modern civilizations, and how this understanding can help explain the constant social and economic differences among peoples. He argues that the difference in the evolution of human societies was caused by environmental and geographical differences. He examines the hypothesis that the success or failure of a society is linked to the geographical conditions where it is located. For him, the first known large civilizations originated in the region of the Fertile Crescent, which is where present-day Egypt is, extending to Iraq. And this happened there because it was the first region to develop agriculture. And this happened because this region had a variety of plants and animals that were easier to domesticate, as well as a favorable climate and navigable rivers that allowed for the transportation of food, which made these societies able to develop more quickly than in other regions of the world. On the other hand, African, Sub-Saharan, and Australian societies were not able to develop agriculture due to the lack of domesticable plants and animals, as well as the climatic conditions where they were, which were not favorable. Jared concludes that the evolution of human societies is largely determined by the geographic and environmental conditions where they developed. In general, with few exceptions, societies that developed in regions favorable to agriculture and trade tend to develop more rapidly and, as a consequence, create more complex institutions than societies that developed in unfavorable regions. Notice that, for example, until recently in the so-called Heartland area, the continental heart, which I have already explained here on the channel, we did not have great civilizations, or the ones that did appear did not last very long. Another example of how geography has interfered in geopolitics comes from the Industrial Revolution. There are several reasons why the Industrial Revolution began in England and not in nations that could even be considered wealthier, such as Portugal or Spain. But geography and the type of elites, or in this case dominant castes, are two factors that were decisive. In short, because it's not the focus of the video, Spain, Portugal, and England were empires dominated by the warrior caste that had allied with the merchant caste. But there was a difference. Portugal and Spain had started the race to establish their overseas empires earlier, so their elites were more comfortable with their dominance. They didn't need to innovate because they basically dominated the bulk of the trade routes in the Americas, Africa, and Asia. The Portuguese and Spanish elites essentially were elites of transporters. In England, the situation was much more complicated because they started the race relatively late. There were decades of difference between the English and the advantage of the Iberian empires. So their merchant class couldn't just settle for being transporters and had to seek innovation from the very beginning to make up for that delay. And for that, they placed their bets on industry. France would eventually try to bet on industry as well, but the situation regarding the dispute among its castes was more complicated because it would take much longer for the merchant class to have any relevance in the French political scene. Basically, the French were dominated by the warrior caste in association with the sage caste. Remember that in the case of England, Portugal, and Spain, the warrior caste dominated in association with the merchant caste. But besides the complacency of the Iberians and the lack of resources of the French, the English still had another advantage, which was geography. As the merchant caste gained power in England throughout the 18th century, this opened up political space for the industrial boom of the 19th century, which would in fact be called the Industrial Revolution. And this happened because England had direct access within its territory to a large amount of natural resources, mainly including coal, iron, and water, which were crucial for the development of industry. If we look at the maps of where coal is located in continental Europe, we see that the largest reserves in Europe at the time were in conflict zones, and this would stimulate most of the European wars over the next 120 years, including the First and Second World Wars. But England had this huge reserve within its own territory, isolated by the sea. So the combination of the type of elite that emerged in England with its geography could only result in a merchant empire, technologically advanced, supported by the power of industry. If this coal reserve were in another country, we would hardly have had a similar outcome. The Portuguese and Spanish, even if they were sitting on such a large source of coal, would hardly use it because they wouldn't see the need. If it were in France, besides being pressured by all its neighbors, it still wouldn't have an elite from the merchant class. So you can see how the formation of elites based on a specific caste, along with geography, resulted in the history of the world as we know it. So you realize how Jared Diamond's theory in his book Guns, Germs, and Steel about geography and nature ends up influencing the history and formation of a culture, which in turn leads to Priestland's theory of castes, determining the characteristics of the elites in that society and the structure of that country's society, and which caste will eventually be dominant in that period. And even though Priestland's focus is actually a rather poor reinterpretation of Marxism, trying to force the thesis that we are now heading into a period dominated by the caste of the wise, and therefore a way for him to justify the rise of socialism, which I strongly disagree with, his thesis serves as a basic framework to understand different countries based on their elites, geography, history, and culture. So the two theses from these two authors help us understand why some countries, like Russia or Iran, will hardly ever become democracies. And I say hardly, almost as if saying impossible, while they also explain why the United States became a democracy and maybe even a historical anomaly in the world, which is concerning as the caste of the wise starts to take power in the United States government at the expense of the merchant caste. This might mean that the United States, following this path, could stop being a democracy in the future, which is quite concerning. But let's leave that for another occasion. Thank you all. I hope you enjoyed it. And a huge super thank you to the channel members, because thanks to them I can keep bringing you content about geopolitics and history. And if you can't become a member to help the channel keep growing and bringing content, then share the video, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell. That already helps a lot, especially if you share the channel's videos a lot. Hugs and see you next time.